you ever had a dream, Neo, that you were so sure was real? What if you were unable to wake from that dream? How would you know the difference between the dream world and the real world?
This can't be.
Be what? Be real?
It's going into replication.
Hey, Pop.
Still nothing.
Let's go. Let's go. Tank, we're going to need a signal soon.
I got a fibrillation.
APOC, location.
Targeting almost there.
He's going into arrest.
Lock, I got him.
Now, Tank, now.
Hello there. Welcome to the desert of the real. As you probably might have deciphered, today we're going to be discussing the epic film of The Matrix. Went to go and see it a week or two ago now at the cinema. It's still amazing. You'll be happy to hear. And it just got me thinking about reality again, because it was such an important film for its time. And it just really kicked off a whole change in, I think, the collective consciousness and the way we view reality and its, potential nature. So this is going to be quite an out there conversation. There's going to be no boundaries in thought. I'm going to view it as a creative exploration thought experiment. It doesn't matter how far-fetched we go. And again, it's just been really inspired by the re-release of The Matrix, and this is down to the 25th anniversary, which, when I think about it, it's really crazy, how quickly those last 25 years have gone. But I want to use The Matrix to really, dissect reality and what it is. And maybe just consider, maybe we live in a less than perfect scenario than we're told. In terms of the details of the film, it was originally premiered on the 31st of March in 1999. And I checked, and this release occurred internationally, so it all happened simultaneously. And then the film was, given general international cinema release shortly afterwards. In terms of the film itself, it was really innovative in terms of the way it approached its filming. There's a lot of very, very iconic camera styles that were utilized during the making of this film. And it also very much introduced to a mainstream audience some quite deep philosophical concepts and the idea of consciousness and the nature of free will and also determinism. Stylistically, I reckon the majority of people would really recognize some of the green and dark themes of the film. You have that iconic view of those characters falling down the screen like rain to signify the Matrix and the coding behind it. Another iconic aspect of the film, again, was the camera work. And you have this famous shot where it's like a 180 pan round the performing martial art person as they're doing their sort of ninja kicks in the air. And the camera, and this big bank of cameras all in a row. And they sort of every microsecond, they sort of take an image. And so you have this kind of collage, you put them together, stitch them together. You have this amazing pan round 180 degrees. And some of those sort of imagery had never really been seen before. So again, it was really iconic for the time. But I don't peddle camera technology ideas. I peddle weirdness. So let's get back to the main topic at hand. Not that weird, but yeah, in terms of religious and spiritual concepts, it was filled with them, really, and other ideas to do with Buddhism and Gnosticism and Christianity. So yeah, there was a lot of underlying sort of low-level theology going on within the film itself. Plus, the film was very much centered around the idea of technology getting out of hand, which is very prudent for these times with the advent of AI really becoming more and more prevalent in our world. And this is a tale of AI really taking control of humanity and subjugating them and enslaving them, but in a way that they don't even recognize it actually happening, which is another potential subtext for things that are going on at the moment. And it's like a level of sophistication within virtual reality technology where the user and the wearer is not even aware that they're in the simulation. So yeah, that's another kind of spin on the whole concept of the Matrix, which is quite interesting. But yeah, it's also to do with personal transformation. So there's a real positive thread to the entire story with Neo going on this journey, sort of alchemizing himself, sort of starting at this point, just very unsure of himself, very much the underdog, and then, learns to control and understand how the Matrix works and is very much then able to shape reality in his own terms. But my own personal relationship with the film, Matrix has always been up there as being a very powerful experience. I was really trying to remember the first time I saw it, and I can't quite remember. I think it was the cinema, and I was still living at home with my folks, with my parents. And I'd just seen it before I was leaving to go to university. And I do vaguely remember the feeling of just being incredibly bowled over by the concept and just coming out of the cinema going, wow, wow, what a film. And it was around about the time, when you was going to the cinema was an incredibly exciting thing. And some of the films are incredibly exciting. I guess maybe because it's so overrun with content now, maybe it's less of a precious thing these days. So I don't get that same level of excitement. But thinking about that could be a youth thing. I mean, when you're that age, sort of late teens, sort of 18, 19, it's incredible highs. I remember just get incredibly excited, or you fall in love really, really deeply. But then lows can be quite significant as well. Maybe if you break up with your first girlfriend, it's crushing. I always kind of likened it to the fact that, as a child, if you try and eat like blue cheese or something, it's incredibly powerful taste, and it's just like, because your taste buds are so sensitive. And as you get older, you kind of like stronger tastes, because I've always perceived the fact that maybe your taste buds dull down a bit, so you can kind of eat things like blue cheese or other strong tastes. And yeah, I've always sort of seen emotions quite similar in a way that when you're that age, your emotions are so heightened, you're so connected to everything. So you really feel excitement, you really feel joy, but you really feel sadness at the same time. But as you get older, those kind of sensations anyway seem to dull down. That's my own theory. So maybe that's kind of why I used to get so excited by particular films. But I think the big wow moment was really just to do with a real pivotal thinking. There's this new concept I've never considered before about reality. And up to that point, I'd never considered the structure of reality or what we were living in. And, it just really just kind of completely changed my thought process. And I think it did for a lot of people. Shortly after then, I ended up then going down to Brighton to university there, and I was living in halls of residence. Had an amazing year, quite hedonistic, lost quite a lot of brain cells, fortunately. But we used to have these quite monumental film nights when this is kind of the era where we had DVDs, but I think VHSs were still quite prevalent. So we watched The Matrix. I think I watched it the second time on VHS with other people, and there were people there. There's a group of us, probably about 10 or 15. There's quite a lot of us. And there've been quite a few people in the group who've never seen The Matrix. And I do distinctly remember their reaction after watching the film. They were all like, wow, that's amazing. And they're all kind of, their minds were blown by the complexity of the film. So when I saw recently that The Matrix was being re-released, I thought, it'd be brilliant to go back and go and see it. And I sort of spoke to my mum about it, and she was really up for going. And my dad had never seen it before, so it was a kind of completely new experience as well. And we went to quite a nice cinema in the centre of Chester, and I was really surprised actually how much it held up. Like, considering it's 25 years old, it still to me feels incredibly fresh. And even my dad thought it was like a current film. He didn't realise actually it was filmed a long time ago. He's not really very much plugged into popular culture, so he doesn't know anything about it at all. So yeah, it was quite funny that he assumed it was a recent film. I mean, there are some dead giveaways, like in terms of the computers. Obviously, the technology looks quite dated now. They've got proper old school CRT monitors, whereas now we've all got flat screen LED screens. And then, things like the fashion, they're quite funny as well. Like the sunglasses look quite dated. It always makes me laugh that they're constantly wearing sunglasses, even at night, which if I kind of concentrate too much on it, gets a little bit irritating, but you kind of give it a pass. And then phones as well. This is kind of the advent. I think the first time I got a mobile phone when I was about 19 in 1999. And, the phones were quite, used quite prevalently in that particular film, and very iconic, where it's a Nokia phone and they're clicking this button and the speakers kind of sliding out. So there very much are elements that do date it. But I mean, to be honest with you, I know it's been tidied up in terms of being made HD ready, 4K, whatever it is, and I think they probably added sort of more perfected sound to the film itself as well. But really, like, it was really hard to tell that it was 25 years old. And it's a running theme that's in my head actually, because it feels like over the last, we've kind of moved into this new century. From 2000, obviously 1999 was like a year, just in a few months before the turning of the new millennium. And over the last 20 years, it's like culture sort of homogenized a bit, really. Whereas, if you jump from like the 1980s to the 1960s, an equivalent sort of 20-year gap, I mean, culture looked completely different. Film looked completely different. Music looked completely different. Film looked completely different. It was very much of its time. And then, if you bump from the 60s to the 70s, the same thing. They're very defined decades. And then 70s to the 80s, again, very defined. And then the 90s changes a little bit less, but it's still very much defined in its own decade in terms of the style, the film, photography, fashion. But 2000, 2010, we're in 2024 now. It's strange, like I'm sort of viewing my nephew, my brother's son, and he's into a lot of grunge bands, American grunge bands that I was into when I was a teenager. And it seems like there's a real kind of real homogenization of culture these days. It's less defined. Anyway, that's a little bit of a side rant. But there's other huge aspects of the film that have really influenced culture, particularly, spirituality, the internet in general, conspiracy. People talking about having the red pill moment. There's a very iconic moment in the film where, Neo is given the choice of taking the red or the blue pill. The red pill, he finds out the truth, but obviously it's not pretty. It's an ugly journey. And the blue pill, you're staying within that illusion and you just go back to your normal life. So the red pill concept has very much influenced society deeply, heavily, especially within the conspiracy field. And for me, a real pull-out quote, from Morpheus when he says, define what is real. What is that? Particularly when you have a lot of tech people, large tech people like Elon Musk talking about a simulation. And I'm like, well, contrast that against what? I mean, okay, we're in a simulation, but then what is real? What is outside of that? So this podcast really is utilizing the Matrix, springboarding some of the theories of reality that I'm aware of, things that have come into my view, things that I ponder on quite regularly, especially ones that maybe are a little bit uncomfortable. And that's definitely going to be spoken about in this podcast. It's not all sweetness and light. Sometimes the idea, oh, we're in a school and we're just here to learn things. But, maybe there's something going on that's a bit more nefarious and is actually kind of working against us. Dare I say it, more than just being a school, is it more restrictive, or is our reality more of a prison, more of a system? But along with the theories, I'm also going to look deeper into the esoteric meaning of the Matrix, some of the symbolism, some of the deeper concepts as well. As I touched upon, simulation theory has very much been popularized over these last few years, longer than that, I think. I remember I was living in London. It was a work colleagues I was working at the time, and Elon Musk came onto the scene. I think he was interviewed at some conference and he started talking about simulation theory. And, this soundbite was then spread across the news and everyone was talking about it at the time, and, how he was crazy. It's a wild idea. But now a lot of people are quite comfortable with it and it's become quite a mainstream thing to talk about. I mean, the main story of the Matrix is that humanity is in a sleeping state and they don't even realize this. They're deeply, in a virtual reality simulation. These ideas that, maybe our consciousness, our reality is coming from a computer is becoming more and more popular. And, these ideas aren't new. They've been around for hundreds of years. The very first underpinnings of it. You had early philosophers in the 17th century, René Descartes, and he used to discuss the idea of an evil demon that deceived us and giving us a false reality to believe. So these concepts have been around for a long time. So it's potentially around the sort of 17th century, in terms of like modern Western thinking, these are where ideas of simulation theory maybe started to emerge. But, in the broad spectrum of things, when you're talking about lost civilizations, there are probably other human civilizations that have existed on Earth that maybe had more of a grasp of what reality is, and we're just now coming to more knowledge now as we awaken as a species. Then we move forward another roughly 100 years into the 18th century. George Berkeley, another philosopher, and he perceived reality being on our minds and not physically outside of ourselves. It actually all is internal. And the idea that what we perceive in our minds may not be actually the nature of existence. I mean, you can start to look at, our five senses and how locked into certain spectrums, and light spectrums, sound spectrums, and how limited we are. And even some of the animals around us have a lot greater depth of smell, such as dogs. So they have a huger palette of experiences of smell that we don't have access to. And the same with cats as well. It's funny, when these thought forms such as simulation theory are kind of released into the collective consciousness, it gets taken hold of and then grows, in power, in energy. And that very much happened with Elon Musk, because he's such an influential person. He really popularized the idea, even though it's obviously been around for a long, long time. But in terms of mainstream, I think it was probably the first time I perceived, the idea of a computer simulation, because he brought it up. From my perspective, the idea of a computer simulation, it's hard to really provide physical evidence. And I just find it quite funny where you get these very logical mainstream science people taking it quite seriously when there's really not a lot of information to sort of clarify or to confirm that that is the case. I've never, even when I wasn't spiritual and I wasn't in conspiracies or, I'd always considered myself agnostic. So I always believed in some higher force, higher power. I wasn't sure what it was, but I believed there was something larger than ourselves. And, now thinking about dissecting some of these definitions, they're atheist, agnostic, religious. I find it difficult to sort of perceive how people can become atheistic. Even they might define themselves as being atheistic and start to talk about ideas of computer simulation and being in a simulation. They're already saying that there's a higher power than them, because they're talking about being in a simulation. So then you will have questions like, okay, who's creating that simulation? Obviously, it's a greater force than you. So therefore, it's really hard to then describe yourself as an atheist. Purely you should be agnostic because you do believe in something. But it's weird, like in a way, very logical, technology-based people, maybe working within Silicon Valley or other areas of technology who may be very atheistic, who've completely rejected ideas to do with spirituality or religion. In a way, it's sort of this whole search for higher technology within AI or virtual reality, and thinking about ideas about what maybe humanity is in a computer simulation, maybe this reality is a simulation. It is funny because they're sort of constructing their own sort of belief system, in a way, religious belief system, inadvertently. But what do I think? Well, I think it's really difficult. I don't know. Again, I dispel my beliefs and I'm always open to ideas. The idea that we're in a more sophisticated computer simulation seems simplistic to me, in a way, to a degree. I think humanity's consciousness at the moment really struggles to understand the complexity of reality. It's a humongous, monolithic topic, a monolithic idea. And as humans, we like to categorize them and simplify. Like maybe the ancients, if you talk about maybe seeing UFOs in the sky, they would describe these as sky chariots, because the language they had is that something moving like a mode of transport would be a horse and carriage or a horse. So then they would describe these UFOs as being sky chariots in a way. So I think we're grasping at things that are around us, technologies that are around us, in order to try and describe what reality is. And people are so locked into the electrical paradigm of computer technologies and the internet, computer games, and people now live on the internet, and they're just starting to see reality around them through that prism, that idea of a computer as being actually an overarching idea of reality itself. I just don't think We have the understanding, we don't have the consciousness yet to understand it, and we don't have the language. And I think that's a key point to this, is that, just simplifying it down to computer simulations, I'm not totally dismissing it, but I think the way we kind of look at things, again, is very black and white and very simplified. But again, going back to that famous quote, Morpheus, one of my favorite in the film, what is real? Define real. And he's talking about electrical signals going to the brain. So if they're stimulated, it doesn't matter whether you're in a simulation or in the real world, it's still a real experience. And what are we contrasting against? So we're in a computer simulation now, but then what is the real world outside of that again? Who are the controllers? Who are the creators of this world? It just elicits more questions. And it doesn't really solve anything for me. Going back to the idea of language, I think is pivotal. It's really important because language is the way we define our reality. Many of you know, people talk about the Inuit in various kind of cold regions. I don't know, in the sort of northern parts of Canada, they have so many, like 20, 30 words for snow because, snow's not like a singular thing. It's like created under all sorts of conditions. You've got different types of snow, which they know implicitly. Whereas here in the UK, it might snow once, twice a year, maybe even less than that. And, we just know snow is snow because we have an interaction with it so infrequently. And so we just don't have the language for it. And so it's again the same with reality, just having that language, those words to describe, those concepts to describe and to explore. And going back to ideas to do with remote tribes in the Amazon, I was reading about, they don't have concepts to do with counting. So quantitative tasks are completely impossible. If you were to shout to your friend in conversation, pass me those 5 sticks over there. They just don't have the language or the numbers to say 5. It just doesn't exist. Or if you ask your friend, how many children do you have? They can't answer, which is crazy. So it's just like the idea of quantities just doesn't exist in their reality at all. I mentioned at university earlier, and I remember having quite an influential conversation or like a lecture with a visiting person who came into the school. And he was just talking about some of the main modern ideas to do with philosophy. And he was just talking about how language is so important because it enables us to really describe our reality. And if you don't have the words, then it's hard to really create those thought forms. And then that's an interesting thing in itself, like, how much potentially language is being manipulated to really, hinder. It's a weird one to think about, but how it can hinder humanity's progress if you're kind of basically imprisoned with certain words or you're restricted in the way you talk about things. But there potentially is a darker reasoning behind maybe why the computer simulation theory has become so prevalent. And people talk about it. For me, maybe it potentially downgrades morality. And this may not be true, and I may be off the mark, but it's something I've been considering. Is that if people are sort of considering things as this disposable computer simulation, you could then take a very nihilistic approach where nothing matters. Who cares? We're in a simulation. And there's no boundaries to your reality, and the idea of following rules just feels silly. So, the way you interact with your reality, how you treat people could change because, again, everything feels so disposable because you're in a computer simulation, so why bother? And although I don't believe in all of the religious ideas within Christianity to do with heaven and hell, but I think it gives you like a morality framework. And, before, one of the good things, I think, with kind of religion, it does give you morality. It gives you, what's right and what's wrong. And, things with Buddhism as well is the idea of karma, which I, very much believe in potentially in terms of like the reincarnation cycle, that, if you're doing bad things, that potentially you'll have to come back and to rectify and to like relearn, why that thing was bad. So I think if you don't have that, then again, sort of society and the morality of society really starts to break down. But I find it funny, like I mentioned, the fact that this idea of computer simulation in terms of trying to define that reality, a very logic-based, technology-based, sort of what they call thought leaders within technology, particularly in America, discussing the idea of computer simulation. And like I mentioned, it really not really that much evidence apart from it being a thought exercise to say that we're in a computer simulation. But then when you sort of then bring into the topic of extraterrestrials or UFOs and the overwhelming evidence there is for other intelligences in the universe, video evidence, photography, people experiencing stuff, people being abducted. I mean, there's a whole gamut of like so much information, documents, just so much. And you'd have that very logic, mainstream based person who would dismiss those ideas as crazy. But in the same stroke, they completely consider the idea of computer simulation, very, very sort of seriously, which I've always found quite funny. Being honest, it always maddens me how freely you can talk about the idea of computer simulation and be very academic and very serious and go, oh, yes, it's very interesting, yeah. But yeah, when it comes to ideas of other intelligences, maybe interdimensional entities, of all that, so much evidence for that kind of thing. And it's, you're perceived as being crazy. It's just a really maddening, bizarre aspect of reality that I really struggle with sometimes. So yes, I do get triggered by it. And yeah, maybe there's something to that. Yeah, so that's an interesting thing in itself. The fact that I get so triggered by it. Maybe there's something deep within me that doesn't want it to be true. So yeah, there's another aspect to this conversation. But like I said, that concept, when you're looking at the world around you, trying to describe it through the lens of various technologies and various understandings, so you can try and decode like what life is, what consciousness is. And you can look at the Pythagoreans, and they were very much a philosophical and religious group that operated in the 6th century BC. And they believed that numbers were fundamental to reality, and which they are to a degree, we know that. But it would very much colour their whole perception, their whole view of reality. They just saw everything as numbers. And that's what I'm saying, because now we have that technology crutch, that technology aspect to our society. That's why people are viewing reality through technology. And I'm just highlighting the idea of Pythagoreans, and they're all about numbers and mathematics. That's how they viewed the world, was just purely through numbers. That layer of numbers just colours and forms their perception. Mathematics and symbolism and geometry was all very accessible to them. And that's the way they saw everything, was just through that prism. And apparently, reading a little bit about them, they're a very secretive group. They had initiations, and they even faced persecution for their beliefs as well. So people around them obviously didn't like some of their ideas because it kind of tested their own ideas of what, reality was. But the way our consciousness likes to categorize things, to simplify things so we understand them. And I was just trying to jot down ideas to do with systems, how we view things through system-led exercise, like I was talking about with computer technology. And at the very core, you have various different systems that humanity recognizes on the mainstream level. You might have kinetic systems like combustion engines or water mills, where you have that kinetic energy that kind of creates that movement to perform a task of something, with combustion engines, that's to drive a car, petrol is burnt and then obviously creates motion in the wheels. And water mills back in the day were used to grind all sorts of grains into flour, etc. And then you can look at the wider thing in terms of Mother Nature, Gaia, the Earth, biological systems. We're nature. I'm sat here. I'm a biological system. Me and you, we're biological. That's a system in its own right. And then the real prevalence now of electrical systems, electrical computing, that's a whole other sphere. What I'm trying to highlight, maybe a little bit clumsily, is that idea of there could be a whole range of systems that we're not aware of yet. So you have biological simulation, you could have a computer simulation, but what else is possible? I've mentioned before, spoken a lot to do with ley lines, earth energies, forgotten and suppressed, architecture, stone circles, how do they operate? And this is a whole system that we're still getting to grips with now, like how it truly worked. And the ancients seem to be harnessing earth energies or cosmic energy using particular architecture, using natural materials, stone placed in certain ways, and encountering celestial mechanics. So you're kind of the working with the stars and the moon and the sun and the planet. And it's that very precise harmony of all those things, of the natural objects, its placement, where it is in the land, where the stars are, where the planets are, was creating some kind of energy, creating some sort of light or energy that could be utilized for, I don't know, to illuminate a building, maybe to power particular technologies, or it could be used to heal the human body or heal the land. And there's this whole other system that's there latent that we just completely forgotten about. So what I'm trying to describe in my own abstract way is that we, look at our world through various systems, but there could be other systems like, the ley lines, like the suppressed architecture, like the forgotten use of stone circles. There could be other systems that we don't quite understand or have never understood, which could really explain the mechanics of reality and how things work, how we fit together in the universe, how we fit together in all these dimensions. It's just a concept idea that we just don't have yet. And again, it's a language and it's a concept ceiling. We're kind of limited how we understand things, and potentially a brain capacity. Everyone talks about we only use 10% of our brains, and potentially what is the other 90%. And the same with DNA as well. Scientists talk about junk DNA. What is that junk DNA? People specify that's just latent DNA that's just not understood and has not been activated. And this then ties into sort of new agey ideas, spiritual understandings. You start to the idea of like 5-dimensional reality, 6-dimensional reality, 7-dimensional reality, that alchemized journey of humanity, basically raising in consciousness something maybe due to the sun's rays or something else, or the alignment of the solar system moving through a very energetic period of the galaxy or the universe, which is raising everyone's consciousness, also making people a little bit crazy at the same time. But it's kind of really expanding our consciousness. And so it's enabling us to really understand these bigger concepts, these larger concepts. So if I look at, back in 1999 when The Matrix first came out, and 19-year-old me, and now I'm sort of coming up to 44 years old, which is crazy. And yeah, my consciousness has changed completely. My level of understanding of reality in the world, or what I think the understanding, has changed massively. And that's the same for everyone. And I think it's funny because if, the sort of content you can view now on YouTube or Twitter or any other platform, of the concepts and understanding people are talking about now, and if people had access to that in 1999, people would be like, everyone's gone crazy. I mean, people think that now, but that would be even more pronounced then, because collectively, people's consciousness and just freeness to maybe talk about things has expanded so much. My idea and understanding of reality, what surrounds us, how our consciousness is held, does fluctuate quite significantly. Like any given day can flip-flop depending on maybe what I've read or a video I've seen or maybe a podcast I've listened to. So yeah, there are so many data points flying at us in terms of potentials. It can be really, really confusing, and it'd be really good if there was a rule book to sort of say, look, these are the rules, this is what's happening, and therefore you could, potentially just readjust yourself accordingly. But obviously we're not given that at all. But ultimately, I think, we're all made of energy. Everything's energy. So in a way, everything is an illusion. Everything is a projection to a certain degree. I think definitely we have souls that are eternal, that go on. There's an essence that is real, that will, transcend all of this at some point and move on to another location, another reality, another dimension, another planet, whatever it is. But I think there is maybe an overlay in this reality that's maybe potentially locking us into 5 senses. And so it's really hard to kind of see beyond that. It's hard to see beyond the materialism. But yeah, I am a firm believer in the reincarnation cycle. I think, if you're going to take it from a purely logical, scientific reasoning, I think there is a lot of evidence to suggest that. So that gives me an enormous amount of comfort. And then, yeah, I think there is a certain amount of karma as well. Like if you're doing bad things potentially in this life, maybe you'll have to experience from the other end of it. You'll have to experience the behavior potentially that you're seeding in this lifetime. And, to sort of see 2 sides of it, to see the duality and that we're learning lessons. But there is this annoying little itch, going back to sort of like the Matrix, that something's not quite right potentially, that maybe that reincarnation cycle is broken in some way. There's something that's not working correctly. But again, I could be completely wrong on that. And maybe that's just part of the schooling process of the reality we're in at the moment. I don't know. And then maybe in a year's time, I'll have a completely different view. Maybe some piece of information comes into view that I really, really resonate with, and could change my opinion completely. But at the moment, as I'm recording this, that's my stance on everything. But let me maybe post something, or just let you hear something as an actual counterpoint to that. It's strange. Before I was about to record this, I was just on Twitter, and this video popped in my feed, a guy that I'd never heard of before. It seems quite relevant to the conversation at the moment. The guy's name is Jordan Crowder. I just became aware of this video of him, on his understanding of reality, this simulation, and what it means to him. He had some contact experience with an interdimensional being, or I don't quite understand it. But he was just giving his take, his understanding, what was being told him in terms of how this reality works. And it's very much on the whole sort of new age, kind of slightly extraterrestrial thread of things, so he's taking it from that, point of view.
Hey friends, so last week at the Monroe Institute, I had a conversation with a non-human intelligence that told me the point of human life. I thought it was very fascinating, so I'm going to share it with the class. We went to a place called Focus 21. This is also called The Bridge. It's a place where you can go and connect with past loved ones, amongst other things. While I was there, I wanted to communicate with my past mother. I was essentially told I shouldn't do that at this time, that by design, I was supposed to shed my human family so I could connect with my extended family, I guess you could call it. And that's kind of what's been happening. So through a bunch of different odd scenarios, I have lost the vast majority of my human family, and now I am kind of in contact with my extended family, okay? So that's what's happening. Now I pressed and kept on, wanting more answers and asking questions, and this is essentially what I got as far as what being human means and why we're here. Now, I was told Earth is a simulator. It's a game. Not a game. It's a school, okay? It's a school. We come here to learn. So what do we come here to learn? We come here to learn, first and foremost, there's a ton of different lessons and there's a ton of like little mini games, but the main thing we come here to learn is how to control and harness and master our emotional body. Now you see, most places aren't like Earth, and most beings aren't like humans. We are overflowing with emotion. This is an emotional theme park, just full of emotional roller coasters. So people will ask, why don't these orbs, why don't these beings save us? Why don't they come and bring world peace and cure all of our diseases? Well, we come here, we enter into this Earth life experience knowing it's going to be bananas, knowing it's going to be hard. And that's the point. So they're not going to fix it. There's nothing to be fixed. This is the way it's supposed to be. Now, why would that be? Well, because we're supposed to transcend this. If you can reduce entropy in a high entropy situation, if you can make order out of disorder, if you can spread light in a dark place, if you can show love and compassion to someone that, say, hates you, if you can transcend all these emotions, control them and harness them, that is the point. Now, the base level is just to be human, to come here and have a human experience, because you're still learning, you're still growing, you're still evolving, you're still sending that data back to source, okay? So there is no wrong way. You're not going to fail. But the ultimate goal seems to be to master yourself and to master emotion, to be able to be calm in the face of danger, to be able to show love in the face of hatred, to be able to show, calm in the face of fear, to be able to transcend these emotions, to be able to control and harness the emotional body is so hard. It's so hard. And we come here to do this. First and foremost, that is the prize of the human experience. You can't get this anywhere else. This is what makes the human experience tough and hard and difficult, and also what makes it so special and unique. And beings come here from all over to experience this, to get these valuable points that really do strengthen and level up your consciousness. Okay? So whether you've had 1,000 human incarnations in a row, or whether this is your first one, or whether maybe you took a hiatus, went and traveled around the universe and came back. You're a human if you're in a human body, okay? So I'm human. I don't know what I was in a past life, but I'm human right now. See? All human up in here. And that's special. We're all human. We're all playing the same game. We are full of emotion. We're placed in difficult situations, and we have to rise above and harness and control these emotions. And when you do that, when you really do that, you have mastered the human condition. You have basically graduated. You have, reached the pinnacle of this human experience. And it's hard, and it's ongoing, but that seems to be the ultimate purpose. Again, there's a lot of side missions. There's a lot of other lessons you learn here. So many things. It's a very layered, complex school. But first and foremost, the human experience is an emotional one. And this is an emotional theme park. And we come here to ride the emotional roller coasters and to experience it, first and foremost. That's all you got to do is just experience it. Just live. Just live your life and enjoy it and show gratitude for your life. That's step one. That you win if you do that. But if you really, really want to optimize the human experience, you transcend emotion, you harness and control emotion, and more than anything, you learn how to show love and empathy and compassion in a world that seems to purposely lack it. Now, that's what I was told. That's what I think. Let me know. What do you think? Have a beautiful day. Peace.
So there you go. That's Jordan Crowder. A bit more about him. I was looking on his website. It looks like he's a type of life coach. He's quite into manifestation. He's written various books on being entrepreneurial and sort of spiritual and manifestation techniques. Yeah, so he seems an interesting guy. Never really kind of heard of him before, but it was quite fortuitous that this video kind of popped up in my feed before recording, really. So yeah, if his message is true, then obviously it's quite a positive message, and the fact that, acknowledge the craziness of the world, of this reality, nothing really makes sense, but the whole idea is to really transcend and master your emotions and to sort of maintain that spiritual core, that spiritual calm center, even when things get really, really wacky. But I don't know about you, especially like looking at, the world and sort of like geopolitics, exopolitics, all those things. It's just, it can be quite frustrating, the way the world is, and not to get involved in it. And sometimes I'm like, well, yeah, you could be sort of detachment, but that sort of level of detachment and not getting involved, like it feels like you're not trying to solve the problem. So that is a kind of a duality issue that I struggle with personally, so yeah, sometimes I can kind of take these messages, well, just look at everything with loving detachment. But yeah, I want things to be better. So in that kind of way, yeah, it's a struggle for me to kind of how to react to things. But flipping back to the other side, potentially my take, maybe the reincarnation cycle being broken, and we just keep coming back time and time again, learning the same lessons over and over again. And this is where conceptually the Matrix starts to really kind of resonate with me in terms of like potentially decoding our reality in some way. On the face of it, could appear quite depressing news, that idea of being potentially energetic food. Again, that kind of resonates with some of the concepts held within the Matrix. And the fact that we're in this kind of loop, this kind of never-ending loop of servitude, and we don't realize it. We're not seeing beyond that because our senses are kind of locked in this very narrow paradigm. But my ultimate belief is that we're eternal. So yeah, even though this scenario is crap, I think maybe there is potential for us to transcend this. Maybe that is part of that humanity's hero's journey, to kind of recognize what's going on and then to build and to, transcend out of that. So like Neo, he's really struggling at the beginning. He just doesn't understand how things are organized, what's going on. There's something wrong, but he can tell, but he doesn't know what it is. And he goes through that alchemized journey. And then he becomes this an amazing individual. He just fully embodies himself. All of his fragments and pieces come together. And he ends up, in the end of that first film anyway, he ends up sort of transcending the Matrix, and then he's actually kind of enabled to bend it to his will in a way. But I'm sure over this lifetime, over the years, I'm sure we'll have more bits of information that kind of comes to fruition as our consciousness expand more. We'll probably have more and more of an understanding potentially of what's going on. So again, maybe I'll give a completely different answer to this in a few years' time. Who knows? but to delve deeper into the idea of like essentially what is a soul trap, and so you're just repeating the same lessons over and over again. And there is potentially data for that from remote viewing if you take that as a credible source of information, which I do. I think like anything, potentially it can be hijacked. Your thoughts can be hijacked. You know, if you use a pendulum, it can be hijacked. You know, it was all these things. As long as you're clear, and it's a constant battle, I think, to sort of clear negative energies, influential entities, all of these things, and can kind of influence the human vessel and everything we do. So we've got to be wary of that. So hopefully, you know, this remote viewing group that I'm about to mention, the Farsight group, I hope that they do their due diligence and try and do as many clearings and get themselves in a meditative state to make sure that hopefully some of the information that's coming through is pure and not potentially distorted in any way. So that's always a caveat with discussing things like this. But I've been a long-term subscriber to the Farsight Institute. They have like a Vimeo style video streaming, their own channel, basically. I pay a subscription for it. And they post up videos to do with certain big concepts to do with like potential, you know, bases on Mars or secret space program information that, you know, has come into view, or just general geopolitics, you know, potentially what's happening with certain political leaders and stuff. Are they being influenced by anything? So yeah, that's generally the sort of the output that they have, and I've been a long-term fan. And yeah, so I've been kind of on the same journey as them, and they're sort of trying to decode everything and understand what's happening and what's influencing our reality, what's influencing humanity, what's kind of driving all of this. And it's a book I'd never really heard of before. It's called The Alien Interview. And yeah, the sort of the director of Farsight, Courtney Brown, he had read this book and then found it quite interesting and decided to sort of discover whether the information in this book was correct or not. And if you don't know the book, it centers around the Roswell crash. This is always a big, like, you know, cultural data point with, you know, conspiracy, particularly with extraterrestrials, and, you know, the question of, are we alone in the universe? It always seems to come to the Roswell crash. And there's a lot of mythology that kind of comes around this. You know, some of it's going to be correct, some of it's going to be not correct, and a lot of disinformation, obviously. But the general gist of this book is that there was, within this craft that crashed within Roswell in New Mexico in America, that there were ET occupants that actually survived. There was one particularly that survived. And the army then ended up taking this individual, this being, back to one of their secure facilities, like an army base. And we're trying to figure out how to communicate with the entity. And then what happening, they discovered that the being could telepathically communicate. But this being, who I think was actually female, if I can remember correctly, would only telepathically communicate with an army nurse there. And this army nurse was called Matilda O'Donnell McElroy. Yes, that's the name. I didn't butcher it. Congratulations, Simon. And so this book is consisted of her notes, her transcripts and letters regarding this interaction. So she didn't write the book herself. It was edited together by an individual called Lawrence R. Spencer. But it's all on the information that this nurse gave to this guy to basically collate this book. And yeah, it's a really fascinating book. I read the book myself, and if I can remember correctly, this being the being was actually an artificial creation. So it was a type of avatar. It wasn't AI, but it was controlled by a consciousness elsewhere. So this consciousness was in another sort of avatar, another, like, I don't know what you call it, just another vessel somewhere else in the universe. But was able to control, I think it was like potentially multiple avatars all at once, because their consciousness was so powerful. Anyway, so part of this individual being's consciousness was in this avatar, which was then in this army building, basically. So yeah. So during the period of time that this avatar that was still operating, was still alive in a way, obviously it didn't die in the end, because of the individual's consciousness is still kind of ongoing, like all of us, I guess, in a way. But yeah, during the time of this, when this being was, you know, alive, the army are really trying to sort of get information out from this individual. and it really wasn't playing ball at all and would only really communicate with this army nurse. But some interesting tidbits of information, particularly to do with galactic history, where humanity stems from, how everything fits together in the universe. This, being did start to talk about soul traps, and it was interesting because the being didn't refer to people as a soul. That's obviously a human derived term. She had a completely different terminology. It was called ISB. And the definition of an ISB, so it's IS and then dash or hyphen BE, because the primary nature of an immortal being is that they live in a timeless state of is. And the only reason of their existence is that they decide to be. So yeah, it's quite a succinct, quite beautifully simple crafted term for what a soul is from their perspective. Again, a counter argument to this. I mean, I do flip flop on these concepts, and like anyone, you can hear really amazing life after death experiences. And I remember reading a book way back in the day called, I think it's called Soul. I think it's one of the sort of the books to read on the reincarnation process. Again, it involves like a hypnotist, and through hypnosis, he was able to regress certain clients and then see actually how the whole reincarnation science, the whole kind of system works. So yeah, that kind of information is a real counterpoint to the idea that, oh, this is a soul trap and we just kind of keep coming back to relearn the same lessons and we're energetic food in some way. So that information's there. And I think you can go on YouTube as well. There's lots and lots of videos to do with people's own personal, near-death experiences, stories, and on the whole, the majority of them are really, really beautiful. So that's always an aspect of this whole kind of concept, which is an argument against the whole soul trap idea. But a brief explanation from this being in this book, The Alien Interviews, idea of the soul trap, and this was actually backed up by some of the data that the remote viewers had within their sessions. And let me remind you, again, you're just trusting this Firesight Institute to do everything correctly. But, they have a team of remote viewers. They just give them coordinates. So they don't know what the target is at all. So it's like blind. So it's only the targeter, Courtney Brown, who knew what the target was. And then they video the data that all these remote viewers get back from their sessions. And they generally always correlate. There's a lot of kind of correlation information. And yeah, it backed up a lot what this being was saying. It was confirming the whole story that this actually happened, that there was a being that was captured by the army and it did telepathically communicate with this nurse. But then also some of the things that this individual said, this being said, were also correct in terms of the ideas of a soul trap and the fact that a person dies and there is from a human terminology, their soul is drawn out of the body like a moth to light. You always hear these things about, follow the light, this bright etheric light appears, and then you're just basically your soul, your ISB essence kind of is drawn towards it. And then at some point coming into view, you'll recognize a friend or a family member who then comes towards you to make you feel at ease, through this whole process, because, you've had this amnesia, you don't know what's going on. So obviously this kind of individual, this friend, this family member you recognize is there to kind of help this transition. But from the point of the information of this alien interview, that this is all an illusion in a way to sort of trick the ISB. And so the ISB is then brought out of phase into another dimension, moves up into the heavens, and is then brought into some kind of etheric apparatus, some kind of equipment where intense levels of electricity, stuns the ISB. And they don't know what's happening and what's gone on. And that high level of electricity basically wipes their memories again. So that kind of creates the amnesia. And then they're convinced to go back down to Earth to sort of relearn lessons. You're like, oh, well, you had this argument with this person. You need to go back down to, work this out. And because you've got no context, because, there's that understanding that, when you leave your body, you have full understanding of everything. But, is that true? And obviously, if you're then going to some out of phase dimension where through some kind of etheric apparatus, your soul, your essence, your ISB essence is zapped with loads of electricity, and all your memories of that particular lifetime have gone, and so you don't know where you are. And then you've got this being who you think's a loving being is then telling you to go back down to earth again to relearn the lessons, which you potentially have learned multiple times, but it's just to sort of keep you trapped in that network. Plus, there's another huge aspect of this, the idea of, history, his story, how much of the information is correct. But it does appear that, there's been periods of times of history where pretty horrific things have happened. But then also pretty horrific things are happening now. People are murdered, all sorts of horrible crimes are perpetrated on each other. And that's another huge question, why are the lessons so horrific? The idea potentially maybe you were a herbalist, hundreds of years ago, and you knew sort of amazing ways to heal people's body. But then you were classed as a witch, and then, you were burnt at the stake, so really horrific deaths. Where's the lesson in that? And, and especially if you then have to endure this horrific death multiple times, where's the lesson? So yeah, that's another big question for me. Or even war. We had like World War One. You could have died in that, and then maybe you could have come back and then had to experience World War Two. And each one you're being killed in some horrific way. Again, why is the lesson in that? And then at the moment, it feels like certain forces are literally trying to manifest World War III in some way, shape, or form. So could it happen again? I don't know. But yeah, it just seems like these lessons are really, really horrific. And that just makes me question slightly. But let's go more depressed and let's delve deeper. And let's go a little bit David Icke. He very much popularized his theory. So it's very much in line with, potential prison, like a potential system, which is, entrapping us in some way. And I think David Icke has really popularized this idea of the Saturn and Moon matrix, that, there's something not quite right with Saturn and there's something not quite right with the Moon. And it's involved in creating, a particular overlay within this reality where we can't see beyond the illusion, the five senses, the materialism. It's really hard for us because of some sort of spiritual or other technology that's emanating from these two like planetary bodies that is preventing us from really embodying ourselves fully. There is a huge idea growing in prevalence, the idea that the moon is an artificial body, that it hasn't always been there. And that some of these concepts can be talking now. It's going to be so beyond sort of mainstream astronomy and science, astrophysics. It's just, these are kind of quite wild theories, but should be considered because there's a lot of oral history that kind of comes to correlate some of these ideas. And the idea that the moon was an artificial body and it wasn't always there. And there are talk of pre-lunar civilizations who remember when the moon actually came into position. And if we think about it, the moon, from our understanding, potentially changes everything. It really affects women deeply, within their bodies, even though mainstream science probably doesn't try and recognize it. It also changes the seasons significantly. Every day sort of changes the weather. It's a huge gravitational force on this reality. But again, there are civilizations that have existed on Earth who have memories, before the moon, before it existed. And a lot of the time you'll hear like mainstream science saying, we wouldn't have this ecosystem if we didn't have the moon. But yeah, that's just them saying that. Potentially that might not be true. I don't pretend to know the technicalities of it. I don't have a clue. But I sort of take credence in some of the oral history that comes through. I think it's important to take note of. And so, you get like the Native American tribes of the Cree people, apparently. They have stories of, before the moon was there. Or the Zulu tribe of which is South Africa. And they perceived an ET type being called the Chitauri who brought the moon in. And it's not just those indigenous tribes. There are many other instances of civilization sort of talking about this oral history of like a time before the moon was there in the sky. And, briefly we can look at the moon. It's a strange entity. It's, it's tidal locked, so we only see one side at all times. And, you have the idea of the dark side of the moon. So there's an area of the moon we can't visually see. We're always seeing the same side all the time. And there's lots of discussion, there's lots of whistleblowers have come forward and discussing, architecture on the moon, on the dark side of the moon, potential institutions like NASA and sort of secret government agencies, know this is true and, have taken photography of this and have even built their own, institutions, their own buildings, their own constructions on the moon itself. So there's this whole idea that the moon is inhabited by humanity and potentially other beings already. And, again, there's whistleblowers that discuss this, there's remote viewing data, there's insiders. So there's lots of kind of data points to confirm this potentially. And, you could potentially look at the moon as an observatory for Earth, the fact that it is just always in the sky. I mean, the other day I looked up and it was a bright summer's day, one of the few that you've been getting in England at the moment. And I could see the moon. So it's just always there hanging in the sky. And yeah, you could perceive it, some do perceive it as some kind of control system. And thematically and culturally, we can look at films like The Truman Show, which is an illusionary world, and the whole Truman's world is completely staged, and everyone around him is an actor, and he doesn't realize it. He just doesn't realize that he's like the hero of his own show, and the rest of the world is kind of watching. And what's weird about that film, the actual control room for Truman's world is in the moon. So when he looks up at the sky, Truman can see the moon, but actually that's where the control system is. That's where, everything is controlled in his reality. So this could be a nod to the truth of actually the situation that we live in, or an echo of the collective consciousness that's kind of seeping through. And some do point to the moon being involved in the reincarnation cycle, that, out of phase, dimensionally, souls are drawn energetically to the moon, and there's some particular type of technology that we're discussing to do with, zapping with loads of electricity and creating that kind of amnesia effect. And so it wipes their memories and they don't quite understand what's going on, that the moon is involved that in some kind of way. I did do a video on this many years ago on my conspiracy channel, Reconsider News, about the moon. And it is a strange entity because mainstream scientifically, the moon, due to its size, it shouldn't be held up by gravity. And there's just lots of odds, and especially numerically, if you look at the numerology of how far away the moon is from the Earth, there's all these very, very strange whole numbers that kind of come up as well. So, and the fact that it perfectly covers the sun, during eclipses, and you get this corona effect around, that's just 1 in a million, 1 in a billion chance that it would fit perfectly over the sun. It's just so strange, so strange. So it kind of all adds these ideas that, maybe the moon is an artificial manifestation. It's been intelligently placed there. It's not just a random thing that just appeared in our solar system. So that's the moon. Then we have Saturn. And mainstream historically, Roman mythology, Saturn was perceived as a major god and was associated with the Golden Age. And the same for the Greeks. They also had great reverence for this planetary body. It's Kronos, major Greek deity, and he was the leader of Titans. There was a book written by Troy McClain called The Saturn Death Cult. I read that a couple of years ago. And he made the case that Saturn used to be a sun, used to be a sun in its own right. And actually it was the sun, the major sun for Earth. And so Earth was locked in the orbit going around Saturn as this sun. And then there was a period of time where the Earth's orbit was permanently altered in some way by this increasing presence of the sun we have now. The gravitational pull became larger and larger to the point where, essentially the orbit completely changed, and then everything then started to revolve around our, existing sun. But for a period of time, Saturn was a sun, and the fact that, that was our major sun. And he had some quite fascinating theories to do with how that affected Earth, and especially the whole idea, if you believe in the idea of dinosaurs, and it appears that there are these humongous animals, beings potentially that are on Earth, and generally the vegetation, the flora and fauna was also massive. Everything was big, and there are lots of conspiracies out there in terms of trees used to be humongous, and people talk about sort of some of these mountains being atrophied or sort of fossilized versions of these trees. Could be right, I don't know. I haven't really looked into it deeply, but it's an interesting theory. But because the gravitational effect of Saturn was a lot less compared to our current sun. And this is a reason why everything was so big, where you had these big dinosaurs and these big trees and these big plants, was because when we had Saturn as a sun, that the gravitation was a lot less. And so, beings and individuals and sort of just life forms were bigger in general, because now everything's a lot denser. So there's a lot more pressure. So everything's a lot more compacted down as a result of the gravitational pull. You can take certain things, in reality, as second nature. You don't, because it's always been there. You don't really question it. But the rings of Saturn, it's really bizarre, isn't it? To have that planetary body. You've got those very mystical sort of rings that go around that planet, and you never really question it. From a mainstream science perspective, you sort of perceive it as being debris, like rocks and dust, and that what kind of creates it. But there was a lot of apparently photo evidence from early satellite missions that went past the rings of Saturn, and they actually would see craft, like objects around the rings themselves, actually adding to the rings. So they were maintaining the rings themselves. So it kind of completely goes against the theory that it's all made out of rock and dust, and there's something strange going on, that there's more to these rings around Saturn. And this is all also talked about and theorized in a book called The Ring Makers of Saturn by Norman Bergeron. And he's if you ever sort of watch Project Camelot by Kerry Cassidy, I think she interviewed him many, many years ago. But yeah, he released this book, and his credentials are, was a research scientist himself, and he worked apparently a lot within covert circles. So he had a lot of potential insider knowledge as well. And he released this book, and it had a lot of photographic evidence, showing these craft creating these rings around Saturn. So that's weird. That's strange. What's going on? Like, why is that happening? And why, again, are we never told this? So bringing Mr. David Icke back into the frame of things, he speaks about the Saturn moon matrix. Many of you may have heard it already. He's had lots of videos. It's one of his main sort of talking points, is this Saturn moon matrix, and how maybe potentially the moon and Saturn and the technology is creating some kind of false overlay and is actually directing reality, and is being radiated, transmitted from the rings of Saturn. And because apparently he sort of perceived these rings of Saturn being almost like sound waves, just on a massive scale. And, maybe in some way this is transmitting something to Earth. It's changing our consciousness. Maybe it's connecting to us. We're all connected to the electric universe. We're connected to all planetary beings and planetary bodies. And so, it's not, for me, such a far out idea that potentially this is a potential. But maybe these planetary bodies of Saturn and the Moon are manipulating humanity's thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and overall consciousness. It's hard to tell that this is true. These are all just theories. But it just brings into the mix, people talk about Saturnian worship, and especially with an esoteric and occult symbolism. There's a lot to point towards that, particularly with the idea of the black cube. This is prevalent in certain religious contexts, the mainstream religious context. In Judaism, I don't know the mechanics of it, but some of them can be wearing like a black cube on their forehead. In Islam, when they go to Mecca, they sort of walk around this big black cube, and generally they're strange black cube sculptures littered across the world in various cultural city locations. I remember when I was in Copenhagen, there was one there. There is this strange symbolism to do with black cubes, and people relate that to Saturnian worship. There's a certain section of potential elites that maybe like worship Saturn, or the being involved in Saturn. I don't know the mechanics of it completely, but that's the general gist. So is it that this mechanism is, creating this matrix-like reality that we're in, or, is that completely wrong? Am I completely off the mark? But just wanted to put that out there. So that's the Saturn moon matrix idea. I think maybe look at the matrix itself, the film itself, decode it. And that first Matrix film, I know they wrote a trilogy that were all quite close together. And then, they recently, I think it was like Matrix Revolutions, which is okay, but obviously not as good as the original Matrix film. And even the trilogy, actually, that first film is standalone the best film out of all of them. It was quite mystically good, in my opinion. The other two after, the first Matrix films were okay, but in a way they maybe spoilt the first film, like, to a degree. So it stands on its own as this quite amazing piece of work. The way it affected everyone's consciousness and ideas of reality, just culturally, it was a big phenomenon. And just, unfortunately, it wasn't like Lord of the Rings, where, I mean, not all of them were as good as each other, but they were at a high standard. And the same with, like, the original Star Wars, potentially, as well. It's just sort of carried on this very high standard of, like, storytelling throughout, all the various sequels and the trilogy. And that didn't seem to happen with the Matrix film. I know on this podcast I've spoken a lot about channeled information, about sometimes really good stories, really good ideas seem to come from nowhere. Like, the people are picking it out of the ether. They're either influenced by something, or maybe they're connected into that general collective consciousness, and these ideas, like this big pool of ideas, that then sort of seeds into someone's consciousness and then bring it into fruition. And it seems to nudge humanity's consciousness along. But you can also look at it as being quite conspiratorial, like the idea of predictive programming, that certain elites are trying to seed some of these theories, these ideas into the collective consciousness. There's whole ideas to do with, like, transhumanism and things, and like how these things, you could then seed it into humanity's consciousness, and then they manifest it because, they're thinking about it all the time. So it comes to fruition. So there's that idea as well. But it could also work in a very basic level, like you go, oh, look at that dark and scary concept. Glad it's not happening here. So it could be a sleight of hand technique where, actually you don't understand what you're in at the moment. You're in something similar, but this film is telling you more than you realize. But the Matrix films were written and directed by the Wachowski brothers, Larry and Andy. Now, interestingly, they both turn into trans women, Lily and Lana, I think it is. But again, they both claim to have directed and written the Matrix films. More on that in a moment, actually. But yeah, they seem to, within their careers, with these Matrix films, they tackle some really interesting concepts. And I think that very much to the first of their time, especially with the Matrix. And other films, preceding films after this, again, sort of tackle quite cosmic ideas. There's Jupiter Ascending, which I thought was okay as a film. And it was all about harvesting sort of humanity's essence and energy. So it's kind of, has a rough thread of connection with the Matrix and stuff, and talks about a larger galactic history of sort of certain elites going around, sort of, draining humans of their energy. So it's kind of potentially, again, a revelation of the method, or echoes of the collective consciousness of maybe actually what's going on in galactic history. There's Cloud Atlas as well, which is very much to do with, like, reincarnation, which is a good film. And V for Vendetta as well, which I can't really remember, but I remember it being quite good. But it's very much popularized the imagery with Guy Fawkes with those masks and things. A lot of their kind of content in their films is quite interesting, some of the topics that they're tackling. But those are the ones that I've seen. I know I think they've obviously directed and written other films as well. But yeah, in terms of the ones, Jupiter Ascending, Cloud Atlas, and V for Vendetta, I didn't actually realize I'd written or directed either of those. Yeah, just as I was researching this, I was like, oh, okay, they did those as well. And they were, all of them, from my point of view, being quite interesting stories. Now, going back, there was a controversy that I wanted to say. There's a controversy with the Matrix films, and a lady called Sophia Stewart claimed that her 1981 screenplay, The Third Eye, was actually plagiarized. So she came up with the idea of the Matrix. Well, she claims she came up with the idea of the Matrix, and also the Terminator films. She claims she sent various scripts to a particular production agency, and which consisted of ideas that were held within the Matrix, but then also Terminator films. But then subsequently, these brothers at the time, she claims they stole the idea and then wrote the Matrix. And also James Cameron, I think, also wrote the Terminator films. She claims that he stole her. So I don't know if that's true or not, but I just thought I'd put it out there. There were various court cases on this. It's a bit hazy. I don't want to spend ages looking into this. Some information I found that these court cases were dismissed, but there was I think there was one court case that was actually went down in her favor, but I can't work out if that's genuine or not. There's lots of conflicting information. I have heard her interviewed before many years ago, but I can't remember what she said. But yeah, I just wanted to put that bit of information out just in case. But yeah, in terms of the Matrix film, there's lots to decode, lots of symbolism, lots of themes, lots of concepts. So yeah, you can go quite nuts looking into this. I remember like many, many years ago, before I had some sort of like conspiratorial spiritual awakening, that I did read a book to do with philosophy and the psychology of the Matrix film. But it was okay, but it's very much on the mainstream sort of surface of things. So it didn't really tackle a lot of the broader, obvious concepts that I'm aware of now. So it wasn't that much of an exciting read. But yeah, at the very start of the film itself, you can kind of look at some of the characters' names. They're interesting themselves. They all have meaning. And you have Neo, which is, the idea of the recent or the one. And so you have things like terms like neoliberalism or neoclassicism. So, Neo is obviously very prudent, the name that they've given Keanu Reeves' character. And then you have Trinity, the sort of female powerful lead in the film as well, falls in love with Neo. You have the ideas of the Holy Trinity, which is the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. That's from the Christian perspective. My own interpretation would be something similar. It'd be like God's source, the Son, the ether. From my point of view, the ether could be, chi energy, could be prana. Take it from Star Wars, could be the Force. So that's that Trinity. Interesting, the name that she has. But it could also mean divine masculine, divine feminine balance in terms of their relationship, Neo and Trinity. They become this big power couple, like soulmate, like twin flames, like destined to be together, and their energies combined make something really, really powerful. Then there's Morpheus, the Greco-Roman god of sleep and dreams, which in the Matrix context is rather interesting because humanity is in a way sleeping. They're all in pods as the machines harvest their energy. So yeah, interesting choice of name for Morpheus. And in the real world, when Neo is brought into the real world, which is obviously a nuclear desolate wasteland because the sky's been scorched and humanity hides from the machines underground, and they traverse these kind of ancient sewer systems using hovercraft ship, and it's called the Nebuchadnezzar. And apparently this is named after a Babylonian king from the book of Daniel. And again, it symbolizes dreams and prophecies, which, in terms of the Matrix storyline, very much fits in. Again, humanity's dreaming, a collective dream, and there's all these prophecies that Neo, the one, comes back to sort of hopefully free humanity and sort of tackle the war against the machines. Then there's the numerology, the numbers involved in the film are pretty fascinating. Trinity at the start of the film is in a room 303, so it's like 33, which is the highest level of Freemason knowledge at the Scottish Rites. So they work their way up the various levels, 33 being the top. There's lots of conspiracies and information to do with like NASA and particularly the Apollo space program. Everyone who worked on there were like, Freemasons, but only at the 33 degree level. So they all had a high level of Masonic information. And, commonly within human body, we have like 33 vertebrae in the spinal column. And this, again, sort of works into the ideas of alchemy, in particular with Kundalini energy, the idea of like the energy working up and you getting enlightenment as the energy, the sort of snake spirals up your spine and then hits your head, hits your pineal gland. And, you have this like Neo type awakening. So yeah, it's interesting that they use the 33. And then for Neo, his room, he lives in this very sort of dilapidated, very sort of junk-filled bedsit, I'll call it, studio apartment, room 101. And again, it's weird because the whole Matrix, you see the sort of the imagery of binary numbers and zeros and ones being the basis of the Matrix. And esoterically can be seen as a portal, start of new hidden knowledge, 101, knowledge 101 is very much culturally known. But the numbers get even stranger. So 9/11/2001, which is the date of Neo's passport expiry, which turns out to be obviously the downing of the Twin Towers in New York. Very strange. This film, released 1999, so I assumed they would have been filming 98, 97, and obviously that event happened in 2001, so that could be a coincidence. Maybe it's predictive programming, who knows, but echoes of collective consciousness again sort of seeping through before it happens, who knows, but yeah, very, very weird. Neo, again, in his small flat or apartment, depending where you are in the world. Trinity is able to type on his computer like Neo's asleep on his keyboard, and she types, remotely on his screen, "Wake up, Neo." And this very much ties into the Buddhist notion of enlightenment and waking up. And then he finds, there's a knock, there's a people at the door, and he sells pirated data to them. And the book that he has, he sells the data on mini discs. So this just kind of dates the film a little bit because you don't really have mini discs. But I don't remember actually having a mini disc with data on. I always remember it as being a format for music. But anyway, he stores these sort of mini discs of data in a book. And the book is Simulacra and Simulation. And it's written by a sociologist, Jean Baudrillard, in 1981 in the book. He discussed the relationship between reality, symbols, society, and generally the modern world, his vision of the modern world, and the fact that the simulation and what is real had been blurred. Interesting, as Neo opens the book, Simulacra Simulation, where has these mini discs stored in there, he's cut a section out of the book so he can fit the mini discs in. But the chapter where he actually opens the book onto is on nihilism. So the writers and directors of this film are really, every single scene, it has like meaning down to the room, the numbers of the room, and also the book that now, stores his data in, even the chapter that the book is opened on. They're all communicating concepts to us. Anyway, there's a section of this chapter on nihilism in this book, and it goes like this. These two forms no longer concern us except in part or not at all. The nihilism of transparency is no longer either aesthetic or political, no longer borrows from either the extermination of appearances, nor from extinguishing the embers of meaning, nor from the last nuances of an apocalypse. There is no longer an apocalypse, only aleatory terrorism still tries to reflect it, but it is certainly no longer political, and it only has one mode of manifestation left that is at the same time a mode of disappearance. The media, now the media, not a stage where something is played, they are a strip, a track, a perforated map of which we are no longer even spectators, receivers. The apocalypse is finished. Today it is the procession of the neutral, of forms of the neutral and of indifference. I will leave it to be considered whether there can be a romanticism, an aesthetic of the natural here within. I don't think so. All that remains is the fascination for desert-like and indifferent forms, for the very operation of the system that annihilates us. Now, fascination, in contrast to seduction, which was attached to appearances, and to the dialectic reason, which was attached to the meaning, is a nihilistic passion par excellence. It is the passion proper to the mode of disappearance. We are fascinated by all forms of disappearance, of our disappearance, melancholic and fascinated, such in our general situation in the era of involuntary transparency. Woo, that guy swallowed a dictionary. Yeah, it's a dense read, really dense read, but I get the gist of it. It's an interesting extract to have the book opened on. Baudrillard there talks very much about terrorism, and yeah, that really ties into the first stage of the film with Trinity and Morpheus. As the viewer, and Neo, you're not quite sure who these people are. But the system at the time, the Matrix system, you're not aware of the Matrix either, is calling them terrorists. And Baudrillard suggests that, when traditional values are eroded from society and the real collapses and stimulated, terrorism is a form of resistance against all of that. It's a reaction to this condition of, that blurring of the lines between what is real and what is simulated. So, yeah, very much those ideas are conveyed within the film itself, within the very fabric of the film itself. going back to more of the symbolism when Neo meets Morpheus for the first time. It's obviously at nighttime. It's always got to be at nighttime in a dark, sort of dilapidated building, adds to the atmosphere of everything. But within this building is a Masonic checkerboard floor. So within Freemasonry, this represents duality, reality of light and dark, of human nature. And then generally throughout this set piece of the film, when Neo first meets Morpheus, there's lots of references to Alice being in Wonderland. And earlier on, obviously, when Neo was in his room, he was told to follow the white rabbit. And the white rabbit was actually tattooed on a lady's arm, which just gave him the impetus then to sort of leave his apartment and go to this club to meet Trinity for the first time. But then there's this very iconic set piece, this very iconic scene where Neo is given the choice. It's the red or the blue pill. And, weirdly, this is a very common color combination, red and blue. In the USA, politically wise, you have the Democrats and Republicans. In the UK, it's reversed, whereas Labour are perceived as being the left candidates and blue being Conservatives, which are perceived as being right. But from my point of view, it's all a bit of an illusion and they're all one big uni party, but that's my own political idealism, I guess. But this ties into ideas of redshift, blue shift, which is fundamental in astrophysics and astronomy. And redshift occurs when an object moves further away. So this makes the electromagnetic radiation increase, which I don't quite understand. I thought it might be the opposite, but apparently this is the case. And then blue shift is the opposite, and it's when a celestial object moves closer. And this actually decreases the electromagnetic radiation, which again, I don't quite understand, but I thought it would be the opposite way around. But yeah, it just goes to show that red-blue combination is intrinsic to our reality, to our cultural, even scientific understanding. And the red pill, in terms of Neo, sees how far he can go down the rabbit hole, but the blue pill means that you wake up and you stay in Wonderland and you sort of carry on with his life in that reality. But taking the red pill, it's that moment of truth, that awakening process. But people tend to categorize the Matrix as being very much a Gnostic tale, Gnosticism. And this is the process of gathering esoteric knowledge through your life, or gnosis. You're on a path of enlightenment and liberation of the world. I mean, we're all on that. Everyone who's probably listening to the podcast, you're doing that exact same thing that I'm doing. So we're all on that Gnostic journey, trying to gather esoteric information, gnosis, and trying to seek enlightenment in a way, shape, or form. On that Gnostic journey, you have Morpheus, who could be perceived as a guide, as like a shaman, really. And Neo being this Gnostic-like savior or Christ-like savior in the realms of Christianity. And so when Neo takes that red pill, he really just has like a psychedelic shamanic experience, that those visuals and those sound effects I always love. Actually, when I went to go see it at the cinema recently, it's just so brilliant when he sort of, goes with inside his own mouth and then kind of awakens in that pod. It's quite visually stunning. But you could very much view that as a psychedelic shamanic experience to enlightenment. And he wakes up in a pod and it's very much like he's being reborn. He's sort of born in that slime, which unfortunately is, the liquefied versions of the dead. But yeah, it just feels very much like embryonic fluid. So it's like he's having a rebirth, an awakening from that kind of shamanic experience. Some of the other larger sort of more political, geopolitical themes that happen within the Matrix, you have like Agent Smith and all the agents, they're kind of representative of the Matrix themselves. They're sort of autonomous. They're all kind of connected in a way, but they're also seem to have their own minds. And they're very much representative of what you would call the intelligence agencies now. So whether it be like Mossad or CIA or MI6, they're very much, they represent the establishment. They're the strong arm of the establishment. And Morpheus and his crew are perceived as terrorists. They're an anarchic secret society in a way. With the beginning of the film, they're sort of classed as terrorists, but actually turned out to be freedom fighters. So it very much sort of plays into geopolitical stories you get now. If you have this oppressive force, obviously that oppressive force will claim you're a terrorist, but for them, they're freedom fighters because they're being oppressed. So, this is stories as old as time, just keeps being repeated. But other really big themes are all to do with technology that is discussed in the Matrix as well. We're in this pivotal time where technology, I mean, back in 1999, like technology was kind of there. It was very much the first time actually had a mobile phone was in 1999. It was just Ericsson phone. You could text, but you were limited on what you could text. There was no smartphones. I hadn't really even got on the internet back then either. It wasn't until I went to university that I actually got an email address for the first time. And then strangely in the halls of residence, we actually had sort of very early, I think it's ISDN. It was a very early form of broadband, so it wasn't dial up. But yeah, when I watched this film, I actually hadn't even been on the internet, and I remember, having a computer, going to university and plugging it in. One of my flatmates actually did IT, was able to set my computer up, and the fact I could sort of download information out of thin air was just miraculous to me. It was just magic. So yeah, it's just strange that back in 1999, the technology was there, but it wasn't as prevalent as now, and we're so glued to our phones. And I'm there now staring at a screen as I record this as well. So it's just completely taken over our lives to the point where people are now trying to put brain implants. There's a big conversation about that, and sort of Elon Musk Neuralink, and obviously they're always going to sort of try and sell these technologies potentially. Oh, it's there to help disabled people, which there is an element of that, but sometimes there's potentially a deeper, darker reasoning behind where they're sort of pushing this, and especially ideas to do with AI become so prevalent. I've been reading a lot of content, listening to a lot of podcasts to do with AI, and sort of some of it's how powerful it's going to get over these next few years. I think it's important that I talk about that in a future podcast or videos at some point. But yeah, it's just, Matrix was tackling with all these big concepts, and this is really before, technology really started to take over our lives, and especially AI as well. So yeah, Matrix really discusses these ideas to do with transhumanism, and it's literally on steroids because, humanity's been completely taken over by machines, and they've been plugged into, electronic system, and they've got ports in their arm, they've got a port in their head. So they've been very much, the merging of humans and machine has been completed, really. And conceptually, one of the big themes was reality versus illusion. What this podcast has been about. What is real? Define real. What is illusion? Define an illusion. Who knows? But also ideas to do with determinism and free will. Actually, how much is they all talk about prophecy and all these various things got to happen, and Neo is going to awaken. He's going to save humanity. This is very much, this is all a determined history. There's a determined future that's going to play out. And it's Dune 2, which I very much enjoyed, and that was, again, it was all about prophecy. Certain things had to happen for to elicit a Christ-like figure to save the universe. So how much of our life, of our reality, is already predetermined? I mean, do we really have free will? These are all big questions that really tackled with the Matrix quite well. Are our lives predefined in some way? And, what is the very nature of consciousness? What does it mean to be conscious? Can you really have a simulated consciousness? Does that exist? What is the difference? I'm sure you've all seen The Matrix. If not, spoiler alert, I've obviously just spoiled all the major themes and storylines in it. But yeah, at the very end of the film, essentially Neo's on this Gnostic journey, this Christ-like journey, and he just awakens to be this demigod status because he's able really to traverse the Matrix. He has superhuman powers. He can fly. He can, dodge bullets. He can stop bullets. He can do all these things. He's got supernatural abilities, and he's then putting the machines completely on the back foot. He's controlling the narrative. But going back to the very fabric of the Matrix, it's our understanding that every individual in that simulation, in the Matrix, they're all plugged into a pod. So whatever character avatar that appears in the Matrix is then actually linked to a real human. They don't realize they're in the Matrix. They're obviously plugged into the system. But I don't know how much of that, how many people in that Matrix are actually real. Maybe there are certain characters or players. I mean, you definitely get the agents that don't have a human consciousness. They're part of the Matrix. So from a certain point of view, that's like an artificial consciousness in a way. And it brings into this idea, it's becoming quite, I keep seeing this in Twitter space and just general internet, the idea of sort of background people, backfill people, or to use colloquial kind of modern day term is the NPC. An NPC has many different a kind of explanations. Some people see NPC because it's people who just they'll read the news or just go along with whatever government says. And so it's quite disparaging words like NPC, non-playable character. Yeah, so there's always like interchangeable terms. So that's a big thing for me at the moment, you know, how much of that within the Matrix, or that idea of like background people, or like, you know, essentially like characters that are part of the simulation that aren't like conscious. They're not alive in a certain way, but they just sort of help the story going a certain direction. And the terminology for NPC, again, which is non-playable character, stems, you know, from the world of computer games. So again, they're like simulations, very basic simulations in their own right. And you'll have the character, which is the main character, which is controlled by the player. So obviously you've got like a human conscious at the end of it, but within particular games, you would have individuals walking around which are controlled by the computer. So they're called NPCs, so they help the whole simulation work. Without them, it just wouldn't work. And so there's a big conversation to be had about with our own reality. Is that true? Do we have NPCs? Do we have backdrop people? Do we have background people? You know, like again, if you were filming a film, you would have the main characters, but in the background in a coffee shop scene, you'd have people pretend to have, you know, pretend conversations. The main characters don't know what they're talking about, but it just sort of creates that illusion of that these individuals in the background are real people and they have real lives. You know, how much of that is true? These are big questions. And I think, I mean, I always seem to talk about Dolores Cannon, but yeah, it's such a big, has a really interesting concept with some of her work. But yeah, talking about her work again, which is, again, if you haven't heard of before, she's a hypnotherapist and she started QHHT, Quantum Healing Hypnosis Technique. And it's all to do with regressing people to try and heal them from various physical and sort of emotional problems. And sometimes some of these issues actually would have a past life connection. But a lot of Dolores Cannon's work turned to be pretty galactic, pretty cosmic, and she's regressing people and they're having lives on other planets or other dimensions. So it's really galactic, sort of central. But anyway, so some of the information, she wrote various books of some of their sessions, and you can find a lot of extracts online, do search on YouTube and stuff. And a lot of her clients would speak about when they're in a hypnotic state and they'd be speaking to their higher self or speaking to, you know, another incarnation in another world. They would all start to talk about your NPCs, like background people. And in a way, it's like Neo, we're all on this hero's journey. We're all individually in our own movie, and our movie needs extras. It needs characters, doesn't it? You know, you have your family and you have your friends, but I went sort of windsurfing yesterday and there was people there at the beach, there's people walking around, you know. Again, there's a big question, like how many of those people actually have souls? How many people are, you know, alive? Maybe they're part of some sort of simulation. So some of Dolores Cannon's work actually really confirm this idea that actually a lot of the people you're seeing in the world, they aren't real. You know, they don't have souls. They're just energy. And they can evolve to a degree like us, but it's not the same. And it's only really with, you know, like myself, where you're evolving as this quite complex soul. But in order to evolve, and in order to sort of develop consciously, you have to endure this simulation with this narrative that's kind of created by the simulation around you and all the NPC characters or background people, which are all part of that. And there is an element to this. It makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable because it sounds quite, you know, grand and like maybe arrogant because, you know, you're using elitist word like I have a soul and these people don't. So I am cautious of this idea because it's like, you know, you're walking around going, oh, I'm the only one that's conscious here. Everyone else is just, you know, a figment of my imagination, an NPC. I don't know. There is a danger in that. And I do feel uncomfortable talking about that because, yeah, it just put you in this quite arrogant terminology and the fact that, yeah, I have a consciousness, but these people don't. So you're making other people like less than you in a way, which is to be avoided. But I think it's important to really discuss these concepts anyway. But I always remember, you know, when you go to like big cities, it's like so vast. You know, I lived in London for like 8 years and I used to walk down some of the streets there and there's just humongous houses and it's just like row after row. And you sort of times that by, you know, God, there's so many like amazingly opulent buildings and places to live in London. And, you know, you times it in your head. It must be like thousands of people with all this like money. It's like, who are these people? And sometimes, you know, you sort of, especially the UK, because it's so densely populated and stuff, and you just like, it's just like street after street after street. And maybe it's my own sort of like monkey underdeveloped mind, but I just can't fathom, you know, what all these people do as jobs, how they earn their money, how they earn this big house. It's just, yeah, kind of it used to bowl me over. Yeah, but potentially that is, maybe there's something to that feeling. Maybe there is an aspect of that. It is part of, you know, the simulation. And, you know, I did have this thing where I was like, oh, maybe I could just do an experiment, just like knock on every single door of the street and just see who was actually a person living in it. But yeah, I didn't do it because I was shy. But yeah, it has always been there in the back of my mind, even before I came to this concept to do with NPCs and backfill people, that might be a possibility. So that's, you know, interesting in itself. I had this intuitive niggle at the back of my mind, but again, I could be completely wrong. This information could be completely false, and like everyone could be conscious. And it's just, yeah, it's just a distortion that's kind of coming through. That's important to point out. There's quite a cult film that really sort of goes to town this idea called They Live. I think it was in the 70s. But yeah, it really encapsulates this whole idea. This guy, just average Joe, average guy, finds a pair of sunglasses. And when he puts them on, he realizes these pair of sunglasses aren't just sunglasses, they're a piece of technology. And he's able to see subliminal messages within advertising. And he sees a lot of the advertisement billboards, they'll have like, you will obey. And so it's like, you know, the message behind the advertising. So when you walk around as a normal human, you just sort of see these nice advertising images of people buying a product and having fun and having this great life. But actually there's this weird subliminal message which you can kind of see. But also when he's walking around like busy, I think it's in New York, he's walking around New York, he puts his glasses on, he can see not everyone's human. And these glasses enable you to be able to see the fact that some of the people, a lot of the people in positions of power, actually they're some sort of alien entity which is being hidden by some kind of projection which makes them appear human. But these sunglasses allow them to sort of see these entities walking around. But it's an excellent film, a really, really good allegory for potentially our reality at the moment. And it's amazing how much of these concepts to do with NPCs are really kind of bubbling up to the surface at the moment. But going back to Dolores Cannon and the idea of the backfill people, she's written it in some of her books. But yeah, one of her practitioners who kind of learnt that technique, which we're going to talk about now, which is Alison Coe. And yeah, she very much reinforced this idea to do with backfill people on a recent video release. And she has a really great YouTube channel. Sometimes when she releases a video, it's just like gold dust. It's quite exciting because she doesn't do it that often, probably like every few months or something. But there's something about her voice. She kind of talks about some of her own client sessions. I know some QHHT professionals, they post up some of the actual audio recordings, but there's something about Alison just actually kind of writes a transcript and then kind of speaks it over YouTube, and they're really, really hypnotic, really relaxing to kind of listen to. And a lot of the time the information that comes through from my clients is incredibly positive. So, you know, in this current chaotic reality, it can be a really nice antidote to some of the fear porn out there, and the fact that there is, you know, something really nice and powerful kind of happening behind the scenes. But as always, I will definitely put a link to this channel in the description. Like anything I like to talk about in this podcast, I'll try and give you a reference so you can kind of check out for yourself. But a recent video she released, it was to do with a German lady who's actually not regressed to a past life, but it was actually to a future version of herself. Again, with these terms, when we were talking about past life, current life, or like future life, is all working within a human linear time concept. But as we know, probably like time is happening all at once, and, you know, time is really a human construct in a way, but it does pinpoint a particular point in time that is in the future from where we are now at the moment. But it really, her regression and the story that kind of came through her was really powerful, and it really plays into sort of new age ideas to do with like a new earth concept. A lot of Alison Coe's content and sort of regressions, they do talk about this transition, like a new earth transition, like some sort of collective ascension that happens for humanity. And this story that she released very much, you know, talks about that as well, like, you know, the earth going through a powerful, intense transition, and it involves northern lights, which can be seen in the sky. So there's a very visual element to this story, key aspect to the story, that, you know, humans on earth, they suddenly start seeing really intense northern lights, and, you know, the earth really starts to change as it goes through this energetic transformation. But during this transcript, her client talks about how the energetic change was just so powerful, it actually disabled the electrical grid and all technology. So it essentially really regressed humanity back, like technology wise. But there was this huge spiritual transformation, energetic transformation, frequency wise. Everyone was upgraded, like DNA, consciousness. They just had a higher level of understanding. It just brought more peace, more comfort to the whole of humanity because they had this huge transition into this new earth. But a key aspect which kind of ties into the background people, the NPC like narrative, is the fact that when they transitioned to this new earth, they realized a lot of people just simply disappeared, like colleagues disappeared, maybe friends disappeared. And they were this brought a lot of confusion. And it actually turns out that the people that disappeared are actually like NPCs. They were kind of backfill people. So they weren't sort of energetically, they didn't have an Isby soul in a way, which is a slight shift from this usual story, because sometimes you hear this idea of like some kind of ascension, like a rapture, where, certain people who have not been great in this lifetime, they carry on not being great in another earth that continues to be very dense. And the people that maybe sort of lived a better life and sort of being nicer to people and the environment around them, maybe they sort of ascended into this different earth. And so there's a slight kind of variation from this where, no, actually, all the humans who had souls, they carried on. It was just the NPCs, part of the simulation, those people sort of disappeared. So as with a lot of these stories coming from Alison Coe and other people who do similar sort of work, that this new earth is beautiful, everything's a lot more balanced, there's just a lot less chaos. People are like working more in harmony with the environment around them and also each other. It's just an easier life experience to kind of have. But a really fascinating aspect to this story is the fact that this whole experience involves quite intense northern lights, the Auroras Borealis. I can't say that word properly, but when they have those really beautiful, colourful lights. In terms of the European like location, it tends to be sort of Scandinavian countries like Norway and like top end just Sweden that, experience these northern lights on a regular basis. But you can get it in the UK a lot of the time, in Scotland, obviously due to the reduced amounts of light pollution, just being that bit closer to, northern climate. You can come to areas where you see the northern lights, sometimes every year, not all the time. But obviously recently we had like a really intense level. I think it was at the time, like allocated to the solar activity we're experiencing from the sun that maybe initiated this intense northern lights. But some people think, maybe this is some kind of man-made frequency technology that kind of created those northern lights. But we had some really intense northern light activity that were just seen across the United Kingdom. I missed all of it. I was inside that evening. I didn't see any of it, but I saw all the photos online afterwards, particularly the ones in Brighton. Took some amazing pictures, like incredible. And it's just weird how this story came out about background people and the fact that there was this, during that transition, there was just intense levels of northern lights. And the fact that we literally recently just had that similar experience. And the energy really was quite different. I remember sort of walking outside and going, oh, something feels off. Like it doesn't feel the same. There's a real fizz in the air. So I don't know whether that's northern light activity is a precursor for something bigger that's going to happen in the future. That really, really fascinates me. So again, the conversations that seem to be happening a lot more to do with background people, but then also this recent Northern Lights experience that a lot of us have had. I don't know quite where in the world, but it seemed to happen in a lot of places, different countries around the world are experiencing these intense levels of Northern Lights. So yeah, it's just quite mystical that this, Alison released this video that seemed to kind of like embody these like two elements. So we can carry on with that idea of NPC, non-playable characters, background people, maybe taking it a little bit deeper. There's a Twitter channel that I started to follow. It's quite interesting information called King of Kings. It's one guy behind it. And he serves up more of a harsher reality in the idea of PCs. And it kind of looks at reality with a bit more of a combative, I would guess, kind of frame of mind. So it may not be in some people's taste, but I still kind of read some of his comments. I think it's quite interesting. He could be true, completely off the mark. I don't know, but I just like to kind of get a broad spectrum of different ideas and thoughts. But again, he speaks in very strong language and strong terms to do with NPCs. That's his preferred use, term is NPC. And he describes, people with a soul who are conscious as being starseeds. And he claims that himself, he's very adept in the astral realms, is where he's kind of collating a lot of this information. He's kind of understanding a 3D world more through his kind of astral realm projections, his experiences there. I mean, I don't have that level of ability. I can't astral project. I've tried sometimes, but yeah, I find it very, very difficult. I've never really kind of practiced at it. And sometimes you hear people warning you against it because you can go into the astral realm, and if you try and come back in your body, something else might have come in your place. So you could be open yourself to attack. I don't know if that's true, but that's what I hear sometimes. But again, this King of Kings guy, he has very strong ideas, very firebrand ideas, I would say. But he perceives the astral being very much like a warfare. It's just like spiritual warfare up there. It's just a nightmare. And he says, whatever happens within the astral is mirrored within the 3D. So from his perspective, if you want to influence anything in the 3D, you have to sort of get a grapple of the astral realms. And he also has a very strong, controversial opinion that Jesus is actually a demiurge. So if you're kind of into Christianity or Jesus, then you're trapping yourself as a starseed into that system through those beliefs. That's his opinion, not mine. I don't know. He could be right, he could be wrong, but I'm just sort of conveying the information. But a very interesting aspect to his perspective is, again, he revolves around the idea of NPCs, but he thinks that they're actually these NPCs, these kind of individuals that are part of this simulation are very aware of starseeds. They see who they are, but they will never let on that they know like a starseed or a soul person. They actually work against them to sort of derail them on their path. So they're very much part of that system. Like an Agent Smith, they're always there to kind of keep, the starseed, that kind of free soul on their path. And so that's his perspective, that NPCs, they're everywhere and they're always trying to, derail you on your path. And so, yeah, from my point of view, that could resonate just because sometimes there have been some incredibly difficult periods of my life. And sometimes you can be like, why is the universe against me? And maybe there's something in that. That is a little bit of a victim mentality. And so, yeah, that could be something I need to heal. But it's also an interesting perspective to consider, maybe that is a possibility. Again, I will, link his profile in the description, so you'll be able to have a look yourself, see what you think. But yeah, he's very much on this NPC narrative, and it is quite fascinating. He claims that he'd interviewed recently an NPC who admitted that she was an NPC, and some, quite interesting information came through, and actually how everything's is quite well structured in the way, sometimes you can end up being in a relationship with an NPC and it's specifically there to sort of derail you and to sort of keep you suppressed in some way spiritually, mentally, and all these things because you're kind of locked into this quite combative relationship. And then also claims that you can have NPC parents as well. So you'd be the conscious ones, but your parents wouldn't be conscious, and they're kind of there to sort of constantly keep you trapped in a way in a sort of a mental psychological prison because you're endowed in this just complex interpersonal, relationships with your parents that sometimes people have. Admittedly, this is quite sort of not depressing, but it's quite negative information. It's fear porn, isn't it, really? So you can kind of look at the background people, that whole concept of being, just part of the simulation, part of reality. It just helps you along in your journey to sort of learn your lessons. Or again, you can kind of look at more of a sort of depressing angle where it's actually there to sort of trip you up. So it's, it's holding you down in some way artificially. But finally, I'm going to sort of leave on something a little bit deeper, a bit more cosmic, even more cosmic. We've been talking a lot of cosmic concepts already. Let's just go down the rabbit hole further. I've been part of this, I've mentioned it before, been part of this healing sort of group meditations, which I've been doing every week. And it's vaguely based off a lady called Ashiana Dean. That's not her original name. Her original name is something else. But I kind of went with this meditation with real, an open mind, because I've been aware of Ashiana Dean's work for a long, long time. It's really, really complex. There are a lot of kind of videos you can watch on YouTube. And then she claims to have kind of relationships with particular guardian races. And it's really complex information and involves a lot to do with like galactic history, energetics, cosmology, spirituality. I've read one of her books. I think it's got 2 books, the Voyagers books, I think they're called. And I read the first one. I think I got halfway through the second one. For some reason, I put it down. I just didn't finish it. I need to go back to it. But the information in it is really dense, in particularly the second one. And it's so dense and so complicated. It is actually like I was reading it going, God, can't come from a human mind, because it's so complex, some of the stuff they're talking about, really complicated. And she claims it's not channeled information. Ashayana Dean claims it's more of a telepathic communication, and actually she warns against channeled information because of distortions and then having entities kind of coming through that give you wrong information. So yeah, there's always that big debate, what's channeling, what's telepathy. I don't know, I can't tell you. But yeah, just kind of putting that out there. But I wanted to read an extract from one of her books called Voyager, The Secrets of Amenti, Volume 2. Just going back to sort of my meditation experiences, a lot of the techniques are sort of loosely based off her work. The sort of practitioner who sort of developed this meditation thing that we do every week. Very young, but just incredibly well connected, has an amazing psychic vision, and I've been deeply impressed with like some of the information that kind of comes through from her, to do with me personally, but then also some of these techniques, and it's really revolutionized my meditation. So for my own personal experiences, only kind of like made me feel that Ashayana Dean's information is more correct than I did before, I guess, just because it's been so beneficial to me. I can't really comment on the galactic history, but energetically, there's a real science energetically to some of the techniques that we do with these meditations, and it's been enormously beneficial. So it just makes me veer to the side of like actually some of Ashayana Dean's work is really, really important. Whereas I try to sort of like, try to absorb all information, but yeah, have that sort of skeptical viewpoint that I'm never going to sort of completely go with one thing. I'm open to everything. But yeah, my own experiences have sort of leaned me towards, thinking this is quite good information. But that's my own personal experience, so it might not resonate for you. But again, before I read this extract, information she claims comes from these guardian races that are really trying to help humanity on their path. And she really does quite openly talk about quite suppressive forces trying to meddle in things and trying to suppress humanity and the inversions that have occurred and things. And that's why kind of this reality, our world is kind of so crazy, because we're sort of transitioning out of that. So yeah, that kind of gives you a bit of background before I kind of do this extract. So yeah, the information is kind of coming from these guardian races. And again, like I said, like, when I was reading it, it's just so dense, it's so complex. It did make me think, this really can't come from a human mind, because it really is just so complicated. And sometimes I can read some of her work and I have to sort of read it and over again to kind of get some of the topics, because it's so dense with kind of conceptually, thematically, it's a real dense read. So the following extract now really sort of kind of helps us maybe potentially understand like the reality and what it is to be human at the moment, and this an idea of the simulation and how we're kind of locked into these 5 senses. And I think it's quite succinct and quite expressive of this potentiality. Through the mutation in the 3rd DNA strand, which manifested as a division within the 3rd chakra and mental body level of the bioenergetic field, a new kind of consciousness developed within the races. As the 1st through 6 base tones and 10th to 12th overtone tones were left operational within the 3rd DNA strand, 2 aspects of a personal mental identity were brought into manifestation. The conscious mind, or the conscious focus of attention, was divided into 2 areas that did not consciously associate with each other. The portions of a consciousness that manifested through the 1st through 6 base tones of the 3rd DNA strand were focused and could perceive within the lower vibrating energy fields of the 1st through 6th sub-frequency bands of the 3rd dimension. The portions of personal identity manifesting through the lower base tones of the 3rd DNA strand became the lower self, or what has become known as the ego, and its perceptions are limited to activity taking place within the lower portions of the third dimension. The portions of identity manifesting through the higher overtones of the third DNA strand became the higher self. The higher self mind could perceive activity taking place within the higher frequency bands of the third dimension. The lower mind ego developed an exaggerated sense of dualistic perception as it became locked into five sensory perception. Only using five sensory perception, extreme distinctions between the inner world of personal identity and the outer world of manifest reality were perceived. As the cognition of where the inside and outside limits meet was blocked from the conscious perception, the inner and outer realities meet within the morphogenic field of the race identity and that of the Earth's core, where the energetic interrelationship between the planet and its people is understood. Through the race morphogenic field in the sphere of Amente, the individual's connection to its race and the purposes of its existence within the greater plan of evolution can be understood, as the evolutionary plans exists within the morphogenic field as an energetic blueprint through which identities and events manifest. The race morphogenic field also holds the indurated morphogenic field for a person and contains the higher dimensional aspects of consciousness through which the contours of the individual incarnation are designed. Through the frequency fence, the ego became cut off from the conscious relationship with its personal morphogenic field and from the morphogenic fields of its race and the planet. The ego awareness felt itself to be isolated and separate from the world around it, and it could not perceive the creative principle or purposes through which it came to be. Human consciousness became locked within the illusion of matter as a result of the frequency fence, unable to perceive or comprehend the reality of non-physical substance through which all manifest things are created. Human consciousness lost touch with its own higher self and with behind all things, and so lost its ability to identify with and comprehend the beings and things that appear to exist outside of itself. Humanity's connection to the divine remained a reality, but the ego awareness lost the ability to consciously perceive that reality. The egotistical mind perceived itself as limited and finite, and so developed an overly aggressive need to dominate and control its external environment as a means of attempting to ensure its survival. As humans evolved to view themselves as finite creatures at the mercy of a seemingly hostile external environment, the lower egotistical mind became isolated, lonely, and very frightened. Healing of the egotistical mind would require its integration with the higher self mind, through which peace and place within universe would be understood. So there you go. That's an extract for her book, Volume 2. Really, really dense read. Actually, it's interesting exercise reading it out loud actually made me understand it a lot more. It was as I was reading it. I'm not the best at reading out loud, but yeah, even as I was reading it, I had more of an understanding of some of the concepts she was conveying. Especially like the podcast I've been talking about a lot of fear potentially of the external reality. So it's just could be my egotistical mind, as he says at the end, that really needs integration into my higher self mind, and then through that process, I will find peace with the universe and understand my place within it. So that's definitely food for thought. But yeah, she mentions a lot to do with race, and from her understanding and information she receives, there are various sacred races that were seeded at the same time, simultaneous at certain locations on the planet. And she talks about the black race, the yellow race, the white race, the red people, and each race having its own morphogenic field and interacting with the earth and the people around them. She's not sort of talking about these concepts in a very racially divided terms. I mean, it's kind of a higher understanding than that. It's just, she's sort of seeing the sacredness in all of the people. There are differences, but there's a sacredness in those differences. There's a morphogenic field with those different kind of races of people across the world. But much of her teachings discusses, the suppression of DNA and the strands of DNA and cutting ourselves off on those higher levels of understanding. And because of that, the ego has grown to be too dominant. And that's why we're kind of in this very sort of fearful state and quite suspicious of each other and potentially the world around us. And it sort of locked us into this frequency fence of these illusions because we're not able to view these higher levels of understanding. So it's giving us these dramatic feelings of separation, of loneliness, when actually the opposite is true. We have these connections there. We're just kind of locked into this strange little bubble. And collectively, humanity really needs to potentially, not only individually, even myself, need to heal that egotistical mind, to sort of feel that connection with each other, the planet, and the, overarching consciousness as a whole. Obviously, a lot of Ashayana Dean's teachings goes into a lot deeper understanding than that. And this is, again, it's really, really complicated read. There's lots and lots of videos online. I find it weird that, because there used to be a really good channel that had loads of like her videos kind of quite neatly posted up in various different kind of lectures. And it was a really useful resource, but yeah, YouTube banned it. And the same with Facebook. There's a group actually kind of went along with a lot of her teachings, and that was taken down as well, which is really bizarre because some of this information is like really, really esoteric. It's not rallying against particular political organizations, or it's not talking about Illuminati stuff or anything like that. It's just very hardcore spiritual information, obviously with a kind of galactic twist to it. But it seems strange that big technology wanted to censor it so heavily. More than anything else that I've ever seen on the internet, both on YouTube and Facebook, and they're supposed to be kind of separate platforms, but they've both taken her content off. So I think that's food for thought. It's quite interesting they've done that. Boy, it's been a long podcast again. It's been great though, as always. Just in conclusions. Summary. What am I going to say? Yeah, as I said, I just flipped between, even this conversation, I've sort of ended on the Ashayana Dean. So I'm now in that frame of mind that, it's just my ego mind that's becoming scared of the outside world. It's why I'm sort of perceiving everything as a prison. That's, I just need to heal that and I'll be fine. So even in the course of this episode, I've changed my mind. This is why, nightmare. But yeah, we had this sort of different perspectives. Are we in a prison, or is everything working perfectly? And we're just in this very intense school for ISBEs, where we can sort of develop really, really quickly as a consciousness. I don't know. I can't, I'm giving you all these various parcels of information, these concepts, and it's up to you to see how you feel about it. But again, like this podcast, my view on this can change just constantly any day, given week, depending on how I feel. It has made the idea of death slightly complicated for me now, because I don't think, we're going to just end up in oblivion, nothing happens. I think, there is like an ISBE soul that goes on to something else, but, what happens after that, there's that big debate that, I see, do you go towards the light or do you avoid the light? That's a big thing. Hopefully when my time before death comes, I'll have figured that out, because at the moment I don't know. And it's a bit of a mind effort actually, just because, the idea of a soul trap, if it does exist, how are you going to counteract it? What are you going to do? What are you going to do to avoid it? Are there things you can do to avoid it? I don't know if it exists. At the moment, it'll never happen, but I think this conversation is important. It's so far beyond what you'd ever hear on television or mainstream in a newspaper. It's out there. But I think these conversations should even happen in schools. I think it's fascinating. It's like philosophy, really. You're just sort of testing the boundaries of your reality, testing the boundaries of what we're in, consciousness. I think it's incredibly important. But many of you, including myself, it does feel like, we're on a runaway train to something, some kind of destination. Like time is happening quicker. It just feels like it's speeding up every year, but so much happens within that year. Things just appear to be more and more chaotic. Who knows whether that's broken system or a system working perfectly as a school to kind of assist us in our journey. I don't know. But it'd be interesting to know what happens in 3-4 years time, whether our perspectives would have changed, whether more information would come out within the collective consciousness. Who knows? Or will we still be completely clueless? I don't know. But it's been fantastic talking to you today. Thank you so much for joining me. I've been Reconsider Simon. You can catch me on reconsidersimon.com, my website. And I'm on all the video streaming. I'm on YouTube, BitChute, Odyssey, Rumble, and I have a Substack. And I'll catch you later. Thank you so much again, and take care till the next time. Bye-bye.
I know you're out there. I can feel you now. I know that you're afraid. You're afraid of us. You're afraid of change. I don't know the future, I didn't come here to tell you how this is going to end. I came here to tell you how it's going to begin. I'm going to hang up this phone, and then I'm going to show these people what you don't want them to see. I'm going to show them a world without you. A world without rules and controls, without borders or boundaries. A world where anything is possible. Where we go from there is a choice I leave to you.